On the 2nd of May 1972, 173 men went to work inside the deepest silver mine in America. Every one of them knew the rule that made their mines safe: rock doesn't burn. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the rule was dead, and so was the man running the only way out. 91 miners never came back up. 2 of them were found alive. 7 days later, a mile underground, eating the lunches of the dead. This is the story of the Sunshine Mine, and how the fans built to keep the miners alive became the very thing that killed them. Kellogg, Idaho, the Silver Valley. By 1972, the Sunshine Mine had produced more than 360 million ounces of silver, the richest silver mine the United States has ever had. It ran 5,600 feet deep with 100 miles of tunnels carved through solid quartzite. And that rock was the reason nobody worried about fire. Coal mines burned. Everyone knew that. Coal is fuel. But a hard rock mine is a tunnel through stone. The thinking of the day, repeated by miners, by managers, by the government inspectors themselves, was simple: hard rock doesn't burn. The problem is, a hard rock mine is never just rock. It is timber supports by the thousands. It is wooden bulkheads sealing off abandoned tunnels. And at Sunshine, those bulkheads were coated in something new: polyurethane foam sprayed on to seal the air leaks. The Bureau of Mines had certified it safe for use underground. Britain had tested the same material and banned it from their mines 3 years earlier. On the morning of May the 2nd, the men of the day shift rode the jewel shaft down into the mountain, took the man train a mile through the dark, and dropped deeper, 1,000, 2,000 feet more, to the levels where the silver was. 173 men spread through 100 miles of tunnels. They didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the abandoned workings near the 3,400-foot level, something had already begun to smolder. At about 20 minutes to noon, an electrician named Gary Becks stepped out of the shop on the 3,700-foot level and smelled smoke. His boss walked into the main tunnel to check and shouted the words nobody in a hard rock mine ever expected to hear: "There's smoke in the main drift." The supervisors did what experienced men do. They walked toward the problem, 900 feet upstream into thickening smoke, trying to find the source. No alarm had been raised yet. In a coal mine, smoke means run. Here it mostly meant confusion, because this wasn't supposed to be possible. At 3 minutes past noon, the shaft foreman, Gene Johnson, gave the order: evacuate the mine. A chemical stench was pumped into the airlines. The mine's fire alarm, a smell that tells every miner to get out. It would take 26 minutes to reach the far ends of the mine. The smoke was faster. Deep inside the mountain, the fire had reached that 100-foot bulkhead, the one coated in polyurethane foam. The foam that was certified self-extinguishing burned at over 2,000 degrees, and it poured out carbon monoxide at concentrations of 3 to 7%. The lethal dose is 0.04%. And then the mine's own ventilation system took over. 2 150 horsepower fans, the fans that kept the miners alive, caught the fire gases and pushed them the wrong way into the fresh air intakes. The tunnels that were supposed to carry clean air to every level of the mine now carried poison instead. The mine was breathing its own smoke. There was exactly one way out of the deep levels of the Sunshine Mine: the number 10 shaft and the men who ran its hoist. At the controls sat Ira Sliger, 60 years old, 44 years underground, one lung already gone. Beside him, his backup, Bob Scanlon. Cage by cage, they hauled men up from a mile below. 48 men at a time, load after load, as the smoke crept into the hoist room through a small ventilation fan that nobody thought to shut off. Sliger's ruined lungs gave out first. He handed the controls to Scanlon and staggered out. Scanlon stayed. Down at the 5,600-foot station, a 21-year-old cage tender named Byron Schultz loaded the men into the cages. On the 3,100 level, Foreman Gene Johnson, the man who had ordered the evacuation, directed each cage load toward the mile-long walk to the jewel shaft and the surface. And a 24-year-old named Greg Dion stood at the cage doors, tearing open self-rescuers and showing terrified men how to breathe through them. At 16 minutes to 1, a cage carrying 10 men reached the 3,100 level. 8 of them would die anyway, in the tunnels, walking out. And at 2 minutes past 1, 82 minutes after the smoke was found, Bob Scanlon died at the controls, his hand still on the hoist. Below him, 93 men were still in the mine. The cages never moved again. Byron Schultz climbed from the cage into a room full of dying men, felt for pulses, and found none. Then he walked a mile through the smoke to the jewel shaft. He was the last man out alive. Gene Johnson didn't make it. Greg Dion didn't make it. The rescue team member who gave Schultz his own oxygen mask, Don Biener, collapsed where he stood and died. Here is the detail that turned sunshine from a tragedy into a scandal. Most of those men were carrying the device that could have saved them. The self-rescuer is a small canister that converts carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide. It works, but the chemistry generates heat. The air you breathe through it can reach 400 degrees. That heat means it's working. Nobody had told the miners that. There had never been a training session. There had never been an evacuation drill. Some of the units in storage dated back to 1951. So when men bit down on the mouthpiece and the air burned their throats, they did the reasonable thing. They concluded the device was broken and threw it away. Survivors watched 2 senior supervisors do exactly that. One of them said, "This thing is burning the hell out of my mouth." It's no good, both died. 43 of the men who kept theirs on lived. A mile down, on the 4,800-foot level, 2 drift miners, Ron Flory, 28, and Tom Wilkinson, 29, had missed the last cage. They retreated up their tunnel to a pocket of fresh air fed by an old borehole, a 4-foot-wide hole drilled down from the level above. A foreman named Harvey Dion, Greg's father, had pulled the boards off the top of that borehole during the evacuation to let air flow down. It was one of the last things he ever did. It kept 2 men alive for a week. They ate the sandwiches from their own lunch buckets. When those ran out, they walked down the dark tunnel, past the bodies of 7 friends, and carried their lunch buckets back. They drank water dripping from the air cooler. They took turns sleeping, so one of them was always watching the smoke. 7 days. A mile of rock overhead. 91 dead men in the tunnels around them. On the 7th day, a light came down the borehole. The rescue capsule was a steel tube barely wider than a man's shoulders, borrowed from the government's nuclear test site in Nevada. For a full day, engineers rode it down the ragged 4-foot borehole, prying loose rock off the walls as they went, 580 feet down. At 17 minutes to 6 on the evening of May the 9th, a rescue crew stepped out onto the 4,800-foot level and found 2 thin, bearded men waiting at a diamond drill station. Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson had been underground for 175 hours. That night they walked out of the jewel shaft on their own feet into floodlights and applause, and walked straight past their own wives, unable to pick them out of the crowd. They were the last men to leave the Sunshine Mine alive. 91 did not. 217 children lost their fathers. The investigation that followed dismantled every assumption the industry had. The myth that hard rock mines don't burn. The foam certified as safe by the very agency meant to police it. The alarm that took 26 minutes. The self-rescuers nobody was taught to use. The single escape route and the two heroes who died operating it. 5 years later, the United States Congress wrote the Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977. And in the official record, they named this mine. Every underground mine in America would now be inspected 4 times a year. Every miner would carry a self-rescuer and be trained by law to trust the burn. Every mine would have a second way out. In 1977, 272 American miners died on the job. By the year 2000, it was 86. Beside Interstate 90, at the mouth of Big Creek Canyon, a 13-foot steel miner stands with his drill raised toward the sky, his headlamp pointed at the mountain. It was sculpted by a man who worked at Sunshine after the fire. Behind him stand 91 small stones. Every year, on the 2nd of May, 91 lamps are lit, and then put out one by one as the names are read. The safety rules are written in blood, usually blood that somebody was warned about first. If you want the next story, it's the Stardust. A nightclub fire, 48 teenagers, and a verdict that took 42 years to say the words, unlawful killing. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.